So what is this whole YCL Athens thing all about? An Introduction to YCL Athens by J. Connor Skehan. Hello, I'm J. Connor Skehan, and I assume that, since you're watching this, you've heard about YCL Athens and are wondering what it's all about. What its beliefs are, what its goals are, what the acronym YCL stands for, who I am, and why we're doing this. Well, here it is. The world is like seriously messed up. Everything about it. So one day I started to think about what exactly is so wrong with the world, and why today, in 2012, there's still so much suffering. And I came up with a lot of answers. But I'm a physics major. I believe in one equation to simplify and describe a behavior. Having so many answers meant not having an equation to explain the problems that plague the world. And I didn't like that. So I kept thinking. And kept thinking. And kept thinking. And for a long time, I got nowhere. After a while, I started to believe that there might not be an answer. I thought that there were too many variables, that people were too different, that it might be impossible to find a single reason behind every problem in the world. I started to think that the equation that I was looking for just might not exist, and I almost gave up. I mean, not to mention, people have been trying to figure this out since the dawn of humanity, and quite obviously, no one's succeeded yet. So, who was I to figure it out? I mean, I'm only 19 at the time of this recording. But, nevertheless, one day, probably thanks to the beard adding a couple of extra years, I did figure it out. One day, I simultaneously found the reason behind human suffering and an equation to generalize its existence. And, like I was hoping, the equation is short. Very short. So here it is. Without further ado, the equation to explain all human suffering. Suffering exists when the greedy actions of a society or person are greater than those non-greedy actions. Or, repeat that a little slower. Suffering exists when the greedy actions of a society or person are greater than those non-greedy actions. But my own equation just led me to more questions. The problem is that greed is relative. Everyone has their own definition of what is and what isn't greedy. So I had to think about whether or not all of these concepts of greed had anything in common. And that's when I found my answer. Greed, I concluded, is when one person puts their own desires above what's beneficial to the people around them. Greed is putting oneself over humanity. And of course, greed has many forms. In fact, putting oneself over others is so common that we have literally hundreds of words for it. Greed is physical oppression, democratic oppression, social oppression, and economic oppression. Greed is theft, the hiding of truths, consumption, overconsumption, and commercialism. Greed is profit, laziness, the lack of progress, and closed-mindedness. Greed, and greed alone, is the sole cause of everything that is wrong with humanity. Well, if greed really is the single reason behind all suffering and all wrongdoing, then I thought to myself, what would a society be like if it decided not to be greedy? And more importantly, is such a society possible? Firstly, yes, it is definitely possible. My equation says that suffering exists when a society or a person's actions are greedier than they are not greedy. And you see, humans have free will. That means that we get to decide whether we act in a greedy way or whether we act in a non-greedy way. On a personal level, it's easy to renounce greed, or at least to do more good than wrong. you, I, and everyone on this planet have the choice whether or not to care and love for the world around us more than we care and love for ourselves. However, in any society, there will always be someone who values themselves over others, someone who is selfish, someone who creates suffering. That is why a society must decide what kinds and how much greed is allowed. For instance, in America, we can't steal, there's a minimum wage, all citizens can vote, etc. That's because we know that human suffering is wrong, and have created a government that we believe will act to end, or at least greatly reduce, suffering. But the world is still so messed up. Suffering still runs rampant. Oppression is a constant throughout the whole of the world, and the rat race for money consumes our lives in America. Our society's failed us. So then, what would a society, a government, be like if it was formed solely to combat greed in all its forms? To begin with, it would be a government which ensured that someone will always look out for you. So long as you put humanity above yourself, humanity will do more than just support you. It will allow for you and for the future to prosper. If you dedicate yourself to making the lives of the people around you better, and the people around you dedicate themselves to making the lives of the people around them better, then everyone's life will be better. But that took a whole paragraph to explain. And, like short equations, I like short names to describe things. So I asked myself if there's ever been a system in history which has come close to ending greed. The answer is yes. Communism. But real communism. A free, democratic, and united people and government which has actively decided to be defiant of greed in all its forms. And it would never allow for the kinds of atrocities committed by the previous so-called communist states. The offenses committed in countries like the USSR and China were motivated by greed and amorality, the opposite of communism. But enough about what my organization doesn't support. It's time to answer the question posed in the title of this recording. What is this whole YCL Athens thing all about? Well, to put it shortly, the Young Communist League of Athens is about changing the world. It's about creating a society which seeks to end all human suffering, and to do so in the only way that's truly possible, by stopping suffering at its source, by uniting against greed. You see, suffering exists because we as people, as a society, even individually, have chosen to allow for greed to prevail over goodness. And that makes sense. We're just animals after all. So then, I guess it might be slightly inaccurate to say that the Young Communist League of Athens is about uniting people against greed. So to be more accurate, I'll say that YCL Athens is about progressing humanity past greed. Because although we are animals, we have higher brain function. That means that we have the ability to drastically influence the world around us, to create suffering. And with that ability comes the responsibility to stand up for what's right. We have a responsibility to make the world a better place. We have a responsibility to say no to greed. We, as human beings, have a responsibility to end human suffering. So yeah, that's what YCL Athens is all about.